and welcome back to ChessLecture.com. My name is Dana Mackenzie, and today I'm going to do the second of two listener submissions for this month in our usual monthly feature, Learn from Your Fellow Amateurs. So, as I said in my last lecture, I got two submissions this month that were remarkably similar in terms of not in terms of the openings, but in terms of some of the chess themes that came out in them. And so rather than decide between them, I decided to make both of these into our listener submissions for the month. So this one was sent in by a listener named Ryan Elliott from Seattle, Washington. And he's about a 1400 player. And his opponent in this game, this is actually an online game, so it was played at standard time control, something like 30 minutes plus 30 seconds per move. And so his opponent has an online name of Provenance. Don't have any idea what his real name is, but his online rating was 1600 or so. So a nice little upset for our Chess Lecture subscriber. And the subtitle for this lecture is going to be Alert Defense Continued. Because just as in my previous lecture, where we saw that our subscriber's opponent could have saved the position by alert defense and by being aware of his opponent's threats, the same thing is going to happen in this game. So Ryan is white in this game, and his opponent, Provenance, is black. And the game starts as a Petroff defense. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight to f6, and Ryan plays knight takes pawn. Now, at this point, black plays sort of the beginner blunder knight takes pawn. And I know that those of you out there who know this opening and know this trap are probably groaning right now. But the thing, one thing that makes classic traps classic is that people keep falling for them. People who don't know the openings. And so this is a very worthwhile thing to know. Any player of e4 for white really ought to know this opening, and you'll win games with it. Ryan could have won this game. So the correct move for white here is queen to e2, attacking the knight. And if black defends with d5, you just hit it again with d3. And then after the knight moves away, you go knight to c6 check. It's a discovered check. You attack the queen on d8, and so basically white wins the queen and wins the game. It's that simple. Now black does have other possibilities. His best move here actually is to continue copying with queen to e7. But even so, white goes queen takes knight, and black can actually win back the piece with d6, but white just plays d4 or even f4, and white will come out a pawn ahead, and black just does not have compensation for the pawn. So nice trap to know about, and I think that once you're at a 1400 level, you really should start studying openings a little bit, and this is really one of the first traps that you should learn. Anyway, neither player was aware of this, and so Ryan plays knight c3, which is, of course, a perfectly plausible move if you're not aware of the queen e2 trap. So good developing move. Black takes, white takes, and black plays bishop to c5. And Ryan makes a good comment here. He says, I don't understand why he chose bishop to c5. It seems like I gain a tempo and shut him out by playing d4. And so that's what Ryan played. And I completely agree. The move bishop c5 really does just kind of give away a tempo for black. And actually, it's quite similar to the opening I looked at in my last lecture, where black did a similar thing. Maybe the problem here is that black's just kind of used to playing king pawn openings where you stick your bishop on c5, but here it's losing a tempo. And in the opening, especially when you're black, every tempo counts. Anyway, bishop to b6. And now Ryan plays bishop c4. And I got to say, I don't understand this. because here Ryan has criticized his opponent for doing this, and then he does the same thing. He gives away tempo with his bishop. Now, admittedly, Ryan did have a reason. He said in his notes, I played bishop to c4 because I wanted to force him to play d5. I like the e5 outpost for my knight, and I'm trying to turn it into a long-term fixture. So that's good. That shows he was thinking strategically. But the funny thing is that Ryan then abandons this e5 outpost just a couple of moves later. So at least he's being somewhat inconsistent with his moves. So, and really the knight on e5 cannot stay there forever, because it'll eventually get hit by knight to d7, and also eventually it can get hit by the move f6. So it's a little bit unrealistic for White to think that he can turn that into a permanent outpost. But anyway, let's continue and see what happens. White plays bishop b5 check, c6, that's okay. And then bishop e2. And again, this is really not a very good move. And Ryan realized it, actually. In his notes, he says, here I moved my bishop to safety. I thought about playing bishop to d3 instead, which I later on played in the game. I probably should have done it in one move instead of two. And that's exactly right. Okay, so what both players have done in this opening is just squander tempi. And I see this quite a bit in beginner games, or even some intermediate level games. When you're starting out in chess, I think you're just not as sensitive to the importance of every single tempo in the opening. Jesse Cry has done a lecture on the fact that 3 tempi are worth a pawn. So every tempo is kind of like a third of a pawn. And if you just give them away, you're giving away, real, it's like giving away small bits of material every time. So why is bishop d3 better? The reason is that bishop d3 is just the logical square for this bishop. White wants to attack on the king side. Why does White want to attack there? Well, because Black is clearly aiming to castle king side, and Black's king has no defenders over there at this point. So White really wants to concentrate his forces there, and it's so easy. He's got his knight on e5, you put the bishop on d3, you might bring the queen to h5, and instantly you've got yourself a huge attack. So, so I think that this is just perhaps something that as you get more experience, you'll recognize sort of the appropriate places to put your pieces. And I think that both players struggle a little bit this game with where are the right squares for their pieces. So yes, bishop d3 would have been better. Also would have been better a couple of moves ago instead of bishop to c4. Anyway, so Ryan plays bishop e2. Black castles, White castles. Black plays knight d7, so good developing move. And now putting the question to White's knight, this knight that Ryan was so pleased about. And then, rather surprisingly, White now just backs off and plays knight to f3. So if Ryan's really serious about keeping his knight there, then he should probably play f4. I'm not sure that that's a great move. It does create a weakness. It creates the possibility for Black to sink his own knight on e4. But at least if you're playing consistently and wanting to accent your control over e5, then this would have been the way to play. So knight f3, okay, it's okay. But now White really has a position where there's just not very much going on. White's got no threats, and it's just basically a dead even position. Okay, Black plays rook e8, good developing move. White plays rook e1, that's okay. Black plays bishop c7, and I like this move. So bringing the bishop back and starting to tickle White's pawn on h2. So White's going to have to start worrying a little bit about his own king side. White plays bishop d3, and so this is the move, of course, he should have played earlier. So he's now a tempo or two behind where he could have been. And it's sort of funny how actually in this position we're going to see a little bit of copycat going on, where both sides actually start, threatening the same things. So, black threatens h2, white threatens h7. So what's black going to do about it? Well, black plays rook takes rook first. That's okay, good move, I like it. It sort of puts white's queen on the wrong square. And then black goes knight f6. And I'm not sure if I like that move. I would have been more likely to play knight f8. Even though it's a somewhat defensive-looking move, what I like about this is that it stays out of the way of black's other pieces. And the knight has several good places it can go to from f8. It can go to g6, to h5, sorry, h4, or it can go to e6 and f4. There are several good things that it can do here. And even if it stays on f8, it's a very, very solid defender. The late Grandmaster Paul Keres had a saying that you won't be checkmated with a knight on f8. And of course, like all aphorisms, that's a little bit exaggerated. I mean, you can be checkmated with a knight on f8, but it's harder. And the reason is that the knight there is very securely defended. It's hard for white to get at, and it's a good defender. It defends the h7 pawn. So I think this is a position that really called for that move. But anyway, white plays knight f6, which is in its favor. This is a little bit more aggressive, but the demerit of this is that it kind of walks into a pin. And this is a pin that's going to be hard for black to break, because his bishop is stuck over on the queen side. And notice that if black does something like queen d6, say he wants to break the pin right away, well, now white can go bishop takes knight, and black can't take the bishop with his queen because he gets checkmated. So black would have to take with the pawn, and this kind of compromises his king side. So we can see that black is starting to have a few worries about his back rank. And so he plays the move bishop to e6, which is a logical move to block white's control over the e-file. Now white plays queen e2. So he's, and this is a good idea, so he's clearing the square e1 so that he can bring his only inactive piece, the queen rook, he can bring it into the game on e1. And here black has several possibilities. I think if I'd been black, I would have probably put the question to the bishop here with pawn to h6, and with the idea that if white retreats bishop to h4, now white's bishop is cut off from the queen side, and black can now start harassing white's weak pawns on the queen side. And I think black probably didn't do enough of this in the game. So the c3 and d4 pawns are kind of sensitive for white. He can't defend them with his bishop anymore. And if he does something like c4, then the bishop's coming into c3 and hitting the d pawn. And this is going to be a little bit difficult for white to defend. So maybe a better move for white here would be rook to b1. But even so, I think that say black might play something like b5, and now white might go rook to b3, and the rook is now kind of in no man's land, or no rook's land. It's not really in the place where it wants to be. So if I were black, I'd be kind of happy about stranding white's rook in that position. Of course, black's made some compromises too. He's got this weak pawn on c6, and white's got a nice square for his knight on e5. So, so the game, it's a dynamic game. There's strengths and weaknesses on both sides. But in any case, I think that if I were black, I would have thought about trying to make more out of white's weaknesses on the queen side. But instead, black plays bishop to g4, and here's where I talked about the copycat. For the second time, we sort of have copycat here, where white pinned the knight on f6, so black goes and pins the knight on f3. So imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, as they say. So this is an okay move, but I just think I would have been less likely to play that, because having just moved my bishop to e6, I kind of don't want to move it again. But anyway, this is still okay. So let's see what happens. Actually, we get a very interesting position here in a few moves. So white continues rook to e1. And now black plays what I think is really a serious strategic mistake. So black plays bishop takes knight. So the reason that this move is bad is that white can take with his queen. Queen takes bishop. And this actually turns out to be very constructive repositioning for the queen. So first of all, white's got some pressure, more pressure now on f6, but also white's got ideas of attacking h7 as well. So, for example, if black plays queen to d6, which is sort of the logical move, breaking the pin on f6, also threatening queen takes h2 check, white has this very nice move, queen to h3, which both defends h2 and attacks h7. So I love this sort of move, a move that both defends and attacks, the best kind of move to play in chess. Things that do two things at once. And so now black's got a real issue with how is he going to defend his king side. So I think that the most logical move would be h6, again putting the question to the bishop. But now, after bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, white really starts infiltrating black's position with queen to d7. And now, black is getting all sorts of sensitive squares. The bishop on c7, the pawn on b7 are all kind of loose here. And also, remember the back rank. The back rank is also a serious problem. So, for example, if black plays queen d6, logical looking move, right? You're reestablishing the threat on h2. Well, it doesn't work. This loses because white goes rook e8 check. Rook takes rook, queen takes rook. And you might think, okay, black's still okay because he interposes on f8. But now white has a nice winning move. Bishop to h7 check. Beautiful idea. Deflecting the king away from the defense of the queen. And white wins the queen and wins the game. So we're going to see a combination like this actually happen in our game. So black cannot play queen d6, which he really wants to play, and instead he has to play a less good move like queen d8. This is his only move. But white still gets a really nice looking game with rook e7, queen takes queen, rook takes queen. And now, even though we're getting into bishops of opposite colors endgame, and so you might think it's drawish, I think white still has significant winning chances here because he's got his active rook on the 7th rank. And this pawn on f7 can really turn out to be a target. So let's go forward a couple moves. So for example, bishop a5, black belatedly starting to put pressure on the c3 and d4 pawns. White can now play c4. And if black, say, plays pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, now we've got the pressure on f7. And, if black plays, say, rook f8, forget it. This is looking really bad. Black is just way, way too passive. So maybe better for black in this position, the computer recommends rook to d8, trying to get the rooks off. But even so, you go rook takes pawn, pawn takes, bishop takes pawn, rook takes d4, and now bishop takes pawn, check, winning a pawn, king f8. Now this is better defense for black because he's gotten his rook active. He's starting to make threats too. He's got a threat of checkmate, and so white has got to take time to defend that. But nevertheless, white has now won a pawn. He's a solid pawn up. White has a beautiful rook on the 7th rank. There's a weakness on c6 that white can attack. Also, black's king is still a little bit uncomfortable. So I wouldn't say this is winning for white. I think with good defense, black can probably draw, but it'll really take some serious defense for black to hold on here. Okay, so that was a pretty long digression. But my point here, go back to the original position. Yeah, so my point here was that bishop takes knight was not a good move because, it lets white's queen get into the attack with queen to f3, followed by queen to h3, followed by queen to d7. So very nice maneuver with the queen. So black should not have taken the knight unless he knew for sure that white had to take with the pawn. Okay, so now here we get to the irony, which is black goes bishop takes knight, and Ryan plays pawn takes bishop, question mark. So why did he do this? And the funny thing, I think Ryan is proud of this move, judging from his notes. So he says, I am absolutely not giving up the e-file, and I know this before he takes on f3. Okay, so I think when you make a mistake and you're proud of it, that is a sign that there's something that you need to learn. Okay, and so there are two things I think that white needs to learn here. First of all, he needs to be sensitive to weaknesses. So he's already got some really bad weak pawns on his queen side, the c3 and the d4 pawn. And now he's creating weak pawns on his king side as well. So if you think about it, if black could just trade queens and get to an endgame, black would probably be strategically won here because of all those weaknesses. And so, so white's really putting, going all in on this attack. He's putting, all of his chips on being able to checkmate black. And if he doesn't do that, then he's going to be in a world of hurt in the endgame. So that's one thing. And then the second thing to learn from this is something about flexibility. So, so Ryan is very pleased with himself for taking control over the e-file. And so he's saying, I'm darned if I'm going to give up control over that e-file. That e-file is mine. Well, it turns out that that sort of inflexible thinking is just not a good way to play chess. Because if you put all of your eggs in one basket, if your opponent then defends that basket, you're left with nothing. And that's exactly the problem for white here. That by totally committing himself to breaking through on the e-file, he makes black's defensive job easier, because all black has to do is defend the e-file. And if he can do that successfully, as I said, he'll be in really good shape because white's created all these weaknesses. So white was inflexible. In chess, when you have an advantage, and I don't deny that that this control over the e-file, it's a dynamic imbalance in white's favor. But you have to recognize that there are many types of imbalance in chess. And you might want to go to my lecture on 8-dimensional chess, where I talk about this. I talk about the 8 kinds of imbalances, basically 7 from Jeremy Silman's system and 1 that I add of my own. So good chess players are willing to trade one kind of advantage for another. So they'll trade, say, material for initiative, or they'll trade space for creating weaknesses. Or in this case, white has to be willing to trade the control over the e-file for ways to penetrate and attack white's king on the king side, or penetrate with the queen to d7, so an unexpected weakness. So it's flexibility that is the hallmark of the master. So you cannot just put all your eggs in one basket. You have to be willing to take one advantage and exchange it for another advantage. And plus another good thing about that is it keeps your opponent off balance, because he doesn't know where to defend. He defends one thing and whoops, another threat pops up. Okay, so fairly long soliloquy, but I think this is really important for Ryan to learn here, and for lots of other chess lecturers to learn as well. Okay, so pawn takes bishop was played. Black plays queen d6, of course, threatening checkmate. f4, pretty much the only move. And now we get to the other theme for this lecture, the subtitle of the lecture, which is alert defense. So I said in my last lecture, and I'll say it again, that when you're defending the position, you have to be as alert to tactics as your opponent is. You've got to look at what your opponent can do. And in my last lecture, I talked about a maxim from Andy Hortiosa, a friend of mine, expert, and actually now master, who says that in every position, you have to be conscious of the worst thing that could possibly happen to you and keep that from happening. So that's how you avoid the kind of game-losing blunder that black now commits. So black had to realize, what's the worst thing that can happen to him? The worst thing that can happen is to get checkmated on the back rank. So don't let that happen. Well, instead what black does is he lets that happen. He plays rook to e8. And, well, it's not checkmate, but it's pretty darn close. So Ryan plays queen takes rook, exclamation point, beautiful move. Knight takes queen, rook takes knight check. And now black's only way to defend checkmate is to interpose the queen on f8. And now, of course, Ryan could just go rook takes queen and be a piece up, but he's got even better. He plays this little trick we saw before, bishop takes h7 check, and now it's just all over. King takes bishop, rook takes queen, white's a rook up, and black resigned. Nice finish, very good finish, and I congratulate Ryan for spotting the combination. You know, that's important. That's how you win at chess. You spot the opportunities when your opponent gives them to you. Okay? But now let's try learning from this, from black's point of view. So what could black have done to defend this position? Well, I'm going to suggest a couple possibilities. First is the one that I came up with when I was looking at this game, and second is the one the computer comes up with. So the move that I came up with was queen e6. And the motivation here is, you know, as I said, white's put all of his eggs into one basket, namely control over the e-file. So let's contest the e-file. And I'll contest it even at the expense of a pawn. Because after queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, rook takes pawn, I'm going to play king f7, and now white's rook can't penetrate. So at best, all he can do is stay there. So if white goes back, say rook to e3, then black is going to kick the bishop, h6, and then either white retreats the bishop and the pawn on f4 hangs, or else white goes bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and now white could retain his extra pawn, but it's absolutely worthless. We now have a position where the two f-pawns are completely blockaded by the one f-pawn on f6. And we have opposite color bishops, and more importantly, white has no way to penetrate in this position. So this is an opposite color bishop endgame where black can definitely hold. So white can't retreat the rook. To play for an advantage, he's got to go for f5 to retain the rook on its active square. But the trouble with f5 now is that it gets in the way of his own bishop, his bishop on d3. And so what we're going to see here in a couple moves is that white's pieces are going to get all tangled up, and they're not going to have anything to do. So black plays bishop a5, hitting the c-pawn. And if white plays c4 to try to liquidate, black just continues with bishop c3. And so we can see that black is now exploiting those weaknesses that white created. All of those weaknesses. And say if pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, now white's got to deal with the threat on d4. And if he goes bishop to e3, now observe that white's two bishops, those proud two bishops, are doing absolutely nothing. So the one bishop on e3 is just stuck there defending the d4 pawn. The other bishop on d3 is stuck behind the f pawn. It's got no good squares to go to. And so here black can just play rook e8, trade off rooks, and this endgame, even though white's a pawn up, this endgame, I believe, is totally drawn for black. He's going to go knight d6, king f6, and you know, white's bishops are just doing nothing. So I kind of like this defense, and this is what I'd call an alert defense. So realizing what your opponent's big threat is and stopping it, even if it gives up a pawn. That's okay, because white had so many weaknesses that his extra pawn doesn't even matter. Okay, now I was pretty pleased with myself for this. So I put this position on the computer, and the computer comes up with an even better defense. So computers are good for teaching us humility. So if you didn't see the last defense, maybe you want to pause here and see if you can find the really best defense for black. So the thing about queen e6 is, with queen e6, black could draw. But black has another defensive idea which really gives him winning chances. And so here's the move. Okay, so you want to think about preventing White's most serious threats. And the big threats for White are to invade on e7 or to get some kind of combination with invading on e8. So all Black has to do is defend those two squares. What piece can do it? The answer is the king. All Black has to do is play king to f8. And then, as if with a magic wand, White's threats just completely evaporate. There is no back rank threat. If White goes bishop takes knight, Black can now play queen takes bishop. He doesn't have to mess up his pawns. And all of the mating threats are still defended, and this weak pawn on f4 is not getting any stronger. So I think this is going to be tough for White to hold. Or if queen f3, which the computer suggests, belatedly trying to get this queen action going to f3 and h3 and so forth. Well, again, it's too late. You do h6, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, and again, that f pawn is just, it's just really bad. So in this position, White would be glad to even draw. So that's how good the move king to f8 is. So very interesting lesson here, and very similar, ironically, to the last game I went over, where again, the key defensive move was a king move. And I'll say this again, the same thing I said before, which is that I think that in defense, sometimes one underrates these king moves because one thinks about defending with one's pieces. But the king is actually a piece that can take part in its own defense. And so here the king defends all of the weak squares. And, after I saw this move on the computer, it's like I smacked my forehead because I've seen this thing many times before. I can't tell you how many positions I've seen where White's got back rank threats, and the simple way for Black to defend is just to step over to f8 with the king. So if you learn nothing else from this lecture, remember that clever move, king f8. It's a great way of defending against rooks or even queens penetrating to the back rank or penetrating to the 7th rank. So a clever defense and an alert defense. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this lecture. And Ryan, thanks for sending your game in. I hope you've learned something from it. And for ChessLecture.com, this is Dana Mackenzie signing out.
This is Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for OnlineChessLessons.net. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, the 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from OnlineChessLessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending, and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damian for OnlineChessLessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.